Goodness, how you doing, Philip?
So
You're
good. How
good.
are
You're
you?
doing okay. I'm doing good. Good. So, Philip, what you been thinking about? What you been working on? You've been taking all these classes, Ivan Illich, Nick Land, Lacan, all this different stuff. So, where your brain been these days?
I just finished up James Burnham's book, The Machiavellians.
Fascinating.
So he wrote that in the 40s. A couple years before that, he wrote a book called The Managerial Revolution,
Yep.
which Barbara Ehrenreich used with her critique of the PMC. Um, so where my head has been recently is this idea of how do we associate with authors, knowing that certain people have certain readings of them, to kind of break free. So one of the things a lot of people think Machiavellianism has a sinister tone to it, which is understandable. But what I got from Burnham was that Machiavelli was in this time in Italy where there were a bunch of different families vying for power.
Yeah.
And he was looking for this prince figure to unite the country.
Mm.
And it's, I don't see him saying he likes the situation. What I see him saying is, this is how it is. And this might be a pragmatic way of uniting the country. I've also been thinking just about like what happens when the nation state gets too big. I've been thinking about Leopold Kohr, the breakdown of the nation, and how to have certain principles leading this small group, which Burnham calls the iron law of oligarchy. So he says whether or not it's an aristocratic or a democratic myth that's being given to the populace, there's a small group of elites, and he says the health of freedom depends upon that being kind of a semi-permeable group, so that you get new, fresh blood in to think new ways of organizing. And been thinking about this idea of Heidegger's thrownness, to play around with like a thrownness in the sense of throning concepts, taking them and placing them at kind of the top of a value structure. Do you have, does any of that
Well, first off, thank you for sharing all that. I salute you. I think you just named a bunch of thinkers that not enough people have actually read to have the kind of political economy discussion that is needed today. So, for example, if you don't read Leopold Koh, you don't realize that in addition to the question of left and right, like we were saying, there's also up and down. There are certain threshold sides. Like, so, for example, capitalism at a certain scale might work great, but at another scale, it may not. Or at low enough of a scale, it could be exploitative, right? But we don't tend to think that. We tend to think left, right, because if you introduce size, oh gosh, that's an entirely much more situational thinking. And basically, I think something that has killed political thinking in general is indeed not realizing that there's a question of scale that's involved. Now, I think people think they discuss scale when they talk about checks and balances, but actually those aren't necessarily the same thing. Like you could have all the checks and balances be too big of a scale, and just because they check and balance one another, they actually just facilitate one another's power, right? So there's been a conflation of checks and balances with scale. Like, oh, we're making sure the government isn't too big or that corporations aren't so big because they're regulated. Well, my gosh, the people who do financial regulation for the government tend to regulate the Goldman Sachs they worked at last year, right? And it tends to be a revolving door. So, oh yeah, checks and balances, but it's all too big and it's too interconnected as well in those different ways. By missing Leopold Koh, then I think ultimately what you end up down, because also when he talks about the breakdown of nations, it's that play on words where what causes nations to break down and why do we need to intentionally break them down? Well, what causes them to break down is they get too big. And so what would be the political project by which to kind of organize how to intentionally break them down so that they don't get to the place where they're going to break down in a non-controlled way or a manner that's more exploitative? Well, we don't really ask those questions. And so I think that gets us into trouble. Philip, please.
this used to be the status quo, the way that you keep the entire world from warring was keeping the size small enough and kind of having like a bunch of conflicts going on, but they would have rules. They'd be like, okay, no fighting on Sunday. And then it got to like no fighting on Sunday or Saturday. Also Friday, we kind of don't want to. So they would, they were aware of these dynamics. And it's almost as if we're on the precipice of some kind of, hopefully, either a breakdown of collective imagination or a breakthrough in collective imagination where we can say, okay, now we have these tools that have been used for manipulation that can be directed towards conviviality in order to regain things that are lost when things get too big or too small, such as friendship or even like the ability to have shared intelligibility and feel as if you belong to a certain group instead of just being a part of like a faceless mass.
No, I think that's very well put. Well, there's a few things. So one, what you just said that like there's a wonderful gentleman named James Simpkin who talks about military ethics, drone ethics, kind of warfare. And what he points out is a lot of people go, oh, war is hell. So, anything goes. And actually the understanding with people like Dr. Simpkins or Clausewitz or everyone is like there is nowhere where ethics is more important than at war. There is no place where you need to hold the line there, because if that goes out, well, then anything goes at that point. And if anything goes, then you're facing the kind of abyssal grounds by which then civilization, because here's the thing, if anything goes in war, then why should anything not go any other time, right? You start kind of getting those sort of problems. So the abyssal nature opens up that then goes in all sorts of different directions. So Jim Simpkins, Dr. Simpson, Mr. Alex Ebert, it's good to see you today, sir. I hope you are doing well. So no, that question of, well, the ability, because the other thing too, what that leads to is the human has to make choices to set limits, and Mr. Ebert does so great work on limits. They have to choose limits that are not given by the phenomenon, because there's never a rational reason to set the limit if you can always go more. I mean, like what James Simpkins talks about when he talks about like war ethics is if you could win the war by breaking a treatise or using some sort of military technology that's going to massacre everyone, why wouldn't you? Well, because you know that if you do that, it causes a certain escalation that's going to lead to total annihilation, right? But you then have to make a choice to limit yourself that might arrive at complete radical political pressures, and every mind might turn at you. But if you don't do that, like Dr. Simpkins talk about, you get a lot of unintentional consequences. But you see, if we don't even have the category, as we were talking about with Illich, of non-rationality, of having to have that non-rational choice to avoid the Nash equilibrium, where when everyone does what's in their self-interest, you end up in a suboptimal result, well, then we cannot even make intelligible the military officer or the government official who's setting a limit to the size of government or who's setting a limit to the size of territory. All we can interpret that as irrational, right? It has to be an irrational thing that they're doing. Well, then you end up in those the breakdown of nations that Leftwood Coe is talking about. And it also, the reason why I like David Hume is because, like, what David Hume warned is where, when you were talking about those European conflicts or kind of the European nation state, there was an understanding like that those kind of warfares were based on territorial disputes, like they were based on something quite concrete. And what David Hume kind of points at is if war starts being based on a philosophical justification, such as the European spirit or spreading freedom or spreading justice or democracy, well, then there was no limit to it. Precisely because philosophy can be about anything and you can always increase more justice or always increase more freedom, there was no way to set the limit in the facticity of the conflict. So then people would have to choose it themselves. But why would they ever do that? You see, why would you're limiting freedom if you stop the war early. You're limiting the success of justice. So then you have to have the non-rational. It keeps going. Philip, please.
And I think you need a very precise definition of freedom that Burnham does. I'm not saying it's the end-all be-all, but he says it is for the ruled to be able to oppose their rulers.
Right.
And so many times today, even having one of those thoughts and expressing it with people around you, it's almost out of hand dismissed.
Yes.
Because it's just like, well, that is too much, that is too dangerous. But I think that might be a decent guiding light to say that this is actually, no, this contention, this war is concomitant with freedom.
Oh, sure. But then you would need to have, like you're saying, then you would need to have a political sphere where people know that that needs to be what's discussed. Then that would require them to have the skills to do it. It makes me think, like, I agree very much. Mr. Ebert has talked about the need for a sort of suboptimal revolution today, where we intentionally avoid mass efficiency. And so, Philip, sometimes people just raise their hand when they want to speak, shoot off a flare, whatever. And it's very interesting because I'm curious with Mr. Ebert, not to put him on the spot, I see that he's eating and I'm timing when I ask him a question for when he puts food in his mouth. Like when so for example, it's quite clear that if we don't have some sort of intentional sub-optimism, that we end up being basically captured by the algorithms, or you kind of end up in that smoothness that's quite boring. You get that equilibrium. How do you go about convincing people, though, to be suboptimal? How do you go about, like, other than like, do they have to almost know philosophy and follow a philosophical argument to be led to the place where they can understand why the suboptimal is important? Like, do you do it in your art? Because I think this question is interesting because ultimately it is the question of how do you convince someone to do something non-rational, something that seems irrational, but ultimately is the non-rationality required to avoid a Nash equilibria or a suboptimal result. Well, everyone does what's rational. Okay, everyone does what's efficient, and we get blandness. We get suck. So you're like, well, actually, no, you need to do something, quote unquote, non-rational, to use my language, which is be suboptimal. Or in regard to business, we need to set a limit on the size of business or political, like the setting of limits. So it's all the kind of question, I guess the question I think about a lot, because basically if we cannot answer this, I don't know if we can regain a commons, a politics, a meaningful democratic discourse. Because so much of the democratic discourse now seems to be like, how do you convince people to do non-rational things? Like, how do you convince people to limit themselves? How do you convince people to be suboptimal? What does that conversation look like? How do you go about it? Is there a certain intellectual level required to get it? These are things I wonder about. We can also talk about the weather if you like. So, Mr. Alex Ebert, I hope you're doing well, sir. How are you on this fine day?
I'm good. I'm good. It's good to be here. I think that your question brings me again to the necessity of boredom and a philosophy of boredom, and the can you imagine a world absent of boredom? And I don't mean a bunch of people that are very excited to be here, but a bunch of people who don't have a mechanism to recognize the smoothness, the equilibrium, who don't have an internal phenomenological mechanism to recognize when the peak has turned into the plateau. And so when you ask, like, how do we convince people to do suboptimal things, to reintroduce interestingness and depth, which are all suboptimal things. Obviously, I think the easiest way for people to understand this maybe is the scenic route. The scenic route takes longer. It's less optimal, but it's the scenic route. And because it takes longer, it is more interesting. So the only thing that would really convince people to do that, I mean, the only way it's too tedious to try and convince people like you should be doing, that's the moral thing to take the scenic route, is to just introduce so much highway that eventually they're just like, God, this is like a non-experience. And then you just be like, by the way, there's a scenic route. And I think that without that mechanism of boredom, we're really screwed. And I think that boredom is basically the self-relating negativity in Hegel. But boredom really is crucial because it's that moment at which you realize the flatness. And it's the penultimate step to breaking that equilibrium and returning to a life of variance or dynamism. And I guess this is, again, I guess it's an argument for acceleration, because how do we get out of this? Well, we could try and go the other way, but that's not going to happen realistically. Our best bet is to exhaust a current paradigm and to self-saturate to the point of glassy smoothness and equilibrium, beyond which suddenly, at which point hopefully we have a self-relating negativity or a moment of boredom, and we're like, nah, fuck this, and we change. And and I think that I was just talking to someone the other day, but they were complaining about Starbucks or something. They're like, I want that special espresso from like a small villa in Italy, and maybe it was even here. And that's obviously a suboptimal desire, right? Because, and suboptimal in terms of time collapse, the collapse of between ideation and execution, or between desire and acquire. And whereas Starbucks really satisfies that and collapses that phenomenology so much so that now there's a Starbucks anywhere you look, you can just drink it, and there's almost no effort, no scenic route to the Starbucks or in the Starbucks or with the Starbucks. It's just the same thing every time. Never mind that the coffee itself has been totally standardized. You get the same experience every time, and so on. And this person was like, I'm really sick of that. And if you've traveled the world, you eventually become sick of realizing that every single place you go to is the same place you just came from. So, I don't know how that ends up translating. It seemed like you guys were talking about warfare and so on. And I was kind of racking my brain as to how to apply this to that. So, but in general, I think a philosophy of boredom, or at least the appreciation of boredom as a forcing function rather than a listless state. I think boredom is rather a forcing function to new dynamism. So, yeah.
I appreciate you sharing that. And Mr. Jacob Kishir, good to see you on this fine day. I hope you're doing well. It made me think, so it's almost like my beloved Bernard Hankins once said, we had all these kind of people with the Tom festivals who are like, what's the point of art? Why even bother with art? It has no, always like, what we need to do is take a few blocks of the downtown and remove all art. No music, no paint, no shape. And then people will experience why art matters, because when you try to tell them, they have no clue, but it's like, no, let's literally give you 2 blocks with no art, and then you'll understand why it matters. And like, why don't they play music at the restaurant? Because there's no art. It's like, why is the food just thrown on the plate in a random way? Because there's no art, dang it. And it's like, and in the same way, I'm wondering now if you almost need like radical efficiency retreats, like places where you go say, oh, you think all you need in life is efficiency? Well, come spend this weekend here where all we're gonna do is the most efficient way to do everything. And you'll suddenly go, this sucks. Exactly. It's almost like you need something non-efficient to make the efficient not suboptimal, or at Nash equilibrium, I mean, like to be a bad thing, right? So it's interesting where it's almost like it also for me points to where the philosopher, when they realize, say, oh, wow, we need a little bit of that suboptimal, they need to then be good at creating experiences, not just arguments, where people could experience that reality, right? Because if all I do, and this is arguably something that religions could do, right? They could say, talk about God, but then they'd make worship or music or different things. And it kind of speaks to where the philosopher, if you realize something, you also need to kind of go, okay, well, if I would like to make pockets of that or examples of that, what would like a weekend thing look like where we were just radically, we exhausted, you did that massive saturation of efficiency experiences to see that, oh, this actually kind of sucks. Yeah, it does. So maybe you should be careful before the only metric of success you think about is how to increase efficiency in the business, how to increase output, et cetera, so forth. Because it's not much fun, right? Like if you were to ask people, go through your wardrobe and have only the most efficient clothing. Take all the stuff that's not efficient and put it away, and they'll be like, I hate all of these clothes. Yeah, because you actually like the jeans with the hole in it. You don't like, I can tell you right now that my least favorite jeans are the new ones. Gosh, I hate those things. The most efficient jeans and the worst ties are the new ties. They're like nooses, right? And so if you had people go through their wardrobes and it'd be like, and the point that you'd ultimately be saying is, if this is how it is in your daily life, why would it be different in politics? Why would it be different in economics? Why would it be different in social media or technology or anything, right? And you go, oh, well, maybe we need a wider, like I was speaking with Layman Pascal, maybe we need a wider portfolio of metrics by which to determine when something is good or not. But I think it also speaks to what you're saying, Mr. Ebert, the notion of boredom or a space to make people face these possibilities of different metrics, or to bring them to this kind of forcing function of realizing, oh, well, it actually makes me think of the joke of retirement. Well, the trick of retirement. Like, people get to retirement and like, now I'm bored, but now I'm at the end of my life, so I can't go back and do something more. So maybe I should have slowed down before this retirement. Like, the funny thing with retirement is, for a lot of people, it's reaching the end of efficiency and realizing that it leaves you in a problematic state, actually. That's why so many people will come out of retirement and go back to work. And it's like, wow, you were really efficient. You followed the path to get to retirement. And now that you have, crap. So it's almost like, I almost am thinking too, like, and I heard a guy talk about this one. It's almost like it would be beneficial. And then if anyone wants to speak, please. Like, a lot of people retire and they have like 20 years of retirement. It seems like it'd be really nice if you could take those 20 years and like move 2 years within people's lives. Like, you know, they had 40 to 42 retired, and then they go back to work, and then 50 to 52. Like, if you could move some of those years in, so people could kind of experience something closer to boredom until the end of their life, because then it becomes much more harder to kind of practically change things around in different things. And the last thing I'll say is also, Jacob and I, Mr. Kashir, we were talking about the value of pilgrimage. And it's very interesting that a pilgrim, like going on a pilgrimage, a kind of spiritual pilgrimage, is radically inefficient. And yet it's one of the most important things you can possibly do, right? Going on a pilgrimage is like really inefficient. Why in the world would you go on this multi-week hard experience and whatever? And yet so many people are like, it's important to them. So there's something about how to bring those kind of experiences, not merely arguments, to people's lives. And what would a political discussion, a social capital business that was aware of the need to bring those experiences in, what would that look like? But let me give it to Mr. Alex Ebert, Phillip, and then Mr. Andrew Parsons. So Mr. Ebert, please.
I love this idea, because usually when we talk about acceleration, we talk about it at a global or cultural scale, and it's very scary and you feel like kind of like a sadist. But if we talked about it at a sort of experimental membranic scale, at a microcosmic scale, I think it's fucking genius, actually, because acceleration is always considered at this macro sort of cataclysmic scale. But if you brought it down to an intentionalized microcosmic scale, it would be, or microcultural scale, I think that would be fucking brilliant. And one of the best and most dramatic ways to present that would actually be sex. You imagine like a sex camp where you're only allowed to have the most efficient sex. And, you know, like, come as quickly as you can. Come on, come on. You know, and you're teaching you how to come quicker and quicker until there's no sex, right? You collapse the space of sex until it just, there's no experience other than the instant satisfaction. In general, I just really love the idea of a microcosmic thing. Installations of my mind is sort of like going with this in interesting ways. But there's one other thing I was going to say. Anyhow, I guess I'll leave it at that for someone's at the door, and if it comes back to me, I'll chime in again.
No, I appreciate. I mean, for me, like with Leopard Co., it's like, what would it look like to have a kind of breakdown of accelerationism, like a bringing into the microcosm of the results of accelerationism in the microcosm breakdown? Because what we're doing right now, following Land, is the only way to think of total saturation is on the big scale. Well, that's not listening to Leopard Co. Then you're like, what you're doing is you're not having a breakdown of the experiences of acceleration. Because for me, the fallacy, like it's like you could break that down. You could have those saturation experiences that could lead to an experiential shift that could be valuable. But let me pass it to Phillip and then Mr. Andrew Parsons. Phillip, please.
Yeah, what would you do after the sex? You know, would you like then get on your phone, like the Catch-22, which I love the Hölderlin poem where he brings up where the danger is thereto lies salvation. This is a catch-22 of what I think like very, very high stakes. If we take away even like the existential risk on a big scale of species extinction, I think what people would be looking at is an erasure of their personal identity or their attachments to that. The idea being that one of the accelerants would happen with personal screen use. I'm reminded of Cal Newport's digital minimalism. And I wonder if you could get enough people exiled from their phones, they would meet each other. But there would be a risk of a different towardness to your just like your fellow man. And I'm reminded too when you were talking about Leopold Kohr, Paul Virilio's architecture, where he starts looking not just in front and behind, but rather up and down, playing with time, being intentional. And yeah, I think there's got to be a way of having a camp, modeling it, and showing people. My one hesitancy, I work in finance, and I've been doing a lot of work in real estate recently. There has been a buzzword called technological obsolescence, specifically in the office and retail space, to be replaced by data centers and warehouses. When I run the numbers, I ask, the owners of the funds, where are you going to get, like, how are you going to make this up? How are you going to fulfill economic growth imperatives? And their answer is screens for kids 3 to 15, developing lifelong customers. And they don't even see it like as anything sinister. They're just like, yeah, this is what they're going to have to do if they want to survive in the environment. I guess until Neuralink comes around. So I'll leave it there.
I think that's a fantastic comment. I'll give it to Andrew Parsons. The thing I wonder is, so like a few things. I sometimes wonder if the way that you help people see the problems of screens is to let and be like, no. You must look at your phone nonstop for the next 24 hours. Not this. What gets people is the look at the phone for 5 minutes, put it away for 30 seconds, look at it for 5 minutes, where you break it up so you never get the full saturation. It's like, no. You are to be on your phone nonstop for like 5 hours. And suddenly you'll be like, this sucks. Yes. So, and is there, because there's always this question, and this actually has a theological presence, like, do you get people to stop doing something by restricting it or having them go all into it, right? Now, it depends on what the all-in thing is. If that's murdering people, then that's not going to work. But there's a weird way in which actually having people see the emptiness of it experientially, or the incompleteness of it, can be very beneficial. So that's something that comes to mind. But let me give it to Mr. Andrew Parsons. Mr. Parsons, it's good to see you today, sir.
Yeah, good to see you. No, I was just thinking, like, you were talking about pilgrimage, and it seems like anytime you're doing something like meaningful, there's never, in the midst of it, you're just kind of, you're so saturated, or you're just engulfed in it that you're like, I don't know what's going on. But then after the fact, that meaning comes to you, and and it gives you that meaningful experience. Like times with friends, you're just enjoying it. You're there in the midst of it. But I think that's the point, is with the experience on the phones, is that, and like you said in some of your courses, and other people, that we think it's helping us, giving us less things to do and more, but it's actually, now we're working at home on, we're checking our emails, we're never escaping, and so it's like it's planned our next steps for the next day and the next day and the next day, and then we're just blinded to it and going down that path. We never get the pilgrimage experience to step out, and be like, what does this mean? And then you're making that meaning from that. Something else that kept coming to, I think, was just, you keep bringing up this non-rationality, and I don't know, to me, it feels like that connects so well with what Zizek means by death drive Marxism, where he's saying, in a sense, that we have to, like, that's his point, is he wants to stop the way, they would just view how Marxism got caught in, whether he thinks that's Stalinism or Eastern Bloc, and it just, continued down the road. The point was, like, his point is to stop. What does he say? That turn on Marx's point where he says the purpose of is to stop and think about, not to change the future, but to stop and think about the future. That's his point, is to make these experiences and kind of drill down on topics. And I think that's the point, maybe, with this, the taking the less, the scenic route about stuff, and coming up on those. But I'll kind of leave it at that.
I think that's perfect. I definitely think Zizek and a number of other philosophers, and hopefully some of the papers and things, I think he is absolutely pointing to this tradition of this notion of something that is non-rational, even if that's not how they language it. Like a lot of the psychoanalytical, Benjamin Fontaine even talks about the irrational, Michel Ponty, tactile. Now, all of there's a lot of people that are basically talking about non-rationality without using that term. And I think one of the challenges and one of the basically tasks of these new liminal web philosophy spaces is to identify similar subjects by different languages and not get too caught up in the language. I'm not saying language doesn't matter. I'm not saying that metaphors don't matter, but it's really important to recognize those associations, connections, and overlaps, just like you're doing. Because Zizek absolutely has a whole lot. Well, a lot of these people who are philosophers, and I'll give it to Mr. Ebert, who are talking about psychoanalysis, they are very similar to, say, the counter-enlightenment thinkers talking about the abyssal basis of civilization. Like a lot of them, like Harman almost talks about the literature. They talk about literature. Well, what is literature? Those are stories of people doing psychoanalytical things, basically. And so there's actually like a long history of thinkers who are kind of aware of some sort of abyssal basis to efficiency, rationality, markets, whatever, but they have different languages for it. And as a result, it seems like they have nothing to do with one another, but there's a lot going on there. And then, yeah, the last thing I was thinking as you were talking, it's kind of funny because nobody hangs family pictures of when they were most efficient. Like no one says, oh my gosh, we were the most efficient today. Let me take a picture. We're going to hang that on the wall. Hey, everyone, look. Oh my gosh, we were so efficient this day. We were so productive. It's really funny that just kind of on a very subconscious level, we all know that the things we really want to preserve, not just take pictures of to share on our social media, but truly, truly like frame. And I actually think it's a secret that so few people print pictures and hang them on the wall anymore. That says a lot of what has happened to the photograph as merely being a currency now. But it's very interesting how the things we tend to want to preserve are not in terms of the metrics that we think. It tends to be the surprise or the meaningful or the unexpected or that time. We got what kind of stories do we tell in community? We don't tell the stories of, man, I was really efficient on Friday, I got so much done. We tell the stories of when we got lost at the airport and thought we were going to miss the plane. Like the very, if there's some sort of slip of the tongue in psychoanalysis, like the slips, that's the reality. Well, likewise, the things we just naturally tend to talk to scream that the human actually organizes and even seeks the suboptimal far more than the optimal. But when you're asked directly about that, you don't want to sound like an idiot. So you say, no, you deny it in the same way that you deny the slip of the tongue in a way, because it unveils something. But anyway, let me give it to Mr. Ebert, Mr. Parsons, and then Phillip. So Mr. Ebert, please. Oh, I like that white side. Look at you at that turtleneck. Nice.
Yeah. Straight class, bro. All right. You have brought up irrationality a lot. I bring it up in the context of game theoretics and the rational player and what happens to game theoretics when irrationality is introduced. Well, theoretically, game theory falls to pieces. And what is the classic irrationality in game theory is not caring about your own self-preservation. So the rational player is someone who cares about their own self-preservation, and that's what game theory is based on, and multipolar traps and all of that. Race to the bottom is predicated on a fear of death. But coming back to what we're talking about here and equilibriums, plateaus, and smoothness, and all the various descriptions, yeah, go for it. It's actually kind of good. But not like ice cream at all. We made ice cream last night. It was terrible. But it's just like frozen sweet milk. total false advertising, this fucking ice cream maker. Anyway, So, all right, I'm just going to riff here for a second, but basically, I'll do it this way. All right, so as you know, Daniel, and I talk about all the time, the mind is basically a mechanism to graduate determinate phenomenological experience, like, whatever, and questioning and deliberation, let's say, into automatism of subconscious operations, so that you'd no longer have to interact with the world wondering what every single little thing you're interacting with is. Like, I'm not like, what is this bowl, as if it's the first time I've seen it. I'm just like interacting with bowl subconsciously. Why? Because that's the most energetically efficient way to interact with the world. Otherwise, I'm spending all my time trying to figure out, and energy trying to figure out what everything is. So the whole point of interaction with the world is that you no longer think about interacting with the world. Now, that's the most optimized state, is a thoughtless interaction with the world. Now, when we think about and I'll position that in a moment as rationality. If we're going to position irrationality as, and someone brought up Marxism as, maybe it was you or the previous, Marxism as the sort of moment of reflection or deliberation on the natural sort of movement of capitalism, the thoughtlessness of capitalism. Marxism is sort of a big no, wait a minute, right? It's not a new expression. It's actually sort of a retardation. What socialism really is a retardation of capitalism, an intentional retardation, like slowing and crippling of capitalism. It's like capitalism light or something. But the reality is that the unabated just flow of human economics does basically express itself as capitalism, and all these derivations are retardations or attenuations of capitalism. But they express themselves in the same way that the mind, when it's thinking subconsciously, because it's integrated everything and it's in a state of pure automism, because automism is the most energy efficient way to operate. Anytime we're not thinking about, whatever, but anytime we express quote unquote free will, we're essentially just simply saying no. It's like Marx saying no to capitalism. That's free will, right? That's an expression to me of free will, because every other time we're doing something, we are doing it in a state of like, what would I say? Of automation, right? Automation is a little weird because it makes you think of machines, but automatism. And it's only when we stop and think about what we're doing that we have that self-relating negativity where we're like, wait a minute, what am I doing? This is kind of weird. This is whack. I want to do something else. Well, that's Marx to capitalism. That's any moment where you decide, oh, I'm just interacting with the world automatically. Wait a minute, let me sit and enjoy this bowl. Look at the artistry of this fucking IKEA bowl. How amazing is it that this thing is in my hand and developed? And what is that color blue? Like, how did they do that? How many native tribes were decimated to like make this manifest, and so on. So anyway, stopping the automatism of thought is an expression of free will, is an expression, though, of, let's just say, irrationality in the way that you've been using it. Like, no, I'm going to do the suboptimal thing. Well, that's irrational, right? So all of a sudden, if we're going to position suboptimal behavior and irrationality as equivalent, then we're going to position rationality and optimal behavior and automatism, which means non-thinking subconscious operations, as rationality, which is interesting because it's the opposite of rational thinking. Is like, oh no, I'm quite agential when I'm thinking rationally because I got the reins in my hand and I'm applying rational thinking. But what's interesting is just to position it as quite the opposite, as rationality is sort of the absence of critical thinking. And this is sort of culturally speaking, like this is almost from an analytical cultural perspective. And irrationality is someone who's like, wait a minute, I'm going to go the other way, and has thought about it and is putting up a big no, as opposed to the subconscious yes, which is just yes, 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 yes. The thrust of what I wanted to say is just to finally tie potentially irrationality to free will, like irrationality and free will, meaning free will, the big no that stops the inertia, which makes our behavior phenomenologically sort of inert, where we're just sort of on this track and I'm just interacting with the world subconsciously and never really thinking about it. And then we interject a big no, and suddenly are able to create a moment of deliberation, which runs or may run counter to the general flow of thoughtless behavior. Anyhow, yeah.
I think that's extremely well put. And I'll give it to Mr. Parsons and then Phillip. We tried to make popsicles out of orange juice that similarly fell apart in a bowl and was enjoyed like the ice. It makes me think too on what you're saying on, like, I think it's very important that we locate the freedom in what seems to be the loss of freedom, like the break, the no. One of the reasons why so often this free will debate does not become useful is because they're looking in the flow of rationality or the determination for the freedom when it's not there until you say no, until you break it. So of course you don't see it because you're looking in the wrong place. Like, so for me, one of the great places to look for freedom is not when I ask you, hey, Alex Ebert, you want to go to the movies? Is not when you say yes, but when you say no. Or no, more pressingly, when you say, oh crap, I don't want to go, but I don't want to tell Daniel I don't want to go because then he might be upset with me. You feel that you lost your freedom. When I ask you to go to the movies and you don't want to go, you feel you lost something. You know you lost something. You wish I wouldn't have asked you. And now you find yourself in a situation where you have to navigate the social tensions of, oh, my friend wants to go to the movies, but I don't want to hurt his feelings, blah, blah, blah. And actually then saying no would suggest that you are not merely reduced to the stimulations of what you're receiving from the outside world, because you have the possibility of saying no and you feel it. That's the other thing. But free will is not an like they talk about it as this kind of abstract notion. You feel it when you lose it. You feel it in the assertion of the no, because very often it's easier to say yes. That's why trying to locate freedom in the yes is such a problem, because that's actually what you want to do. It's almost like there's a difference here between want and will, or that's what's easiest, right? But the harder thing is actually saying no, and that's where you should locate the freedom. But often if we define freedom as doing what you want to do, well, the thing we often want to do is just go with the flow that's going to make our friends happy, responding to the stimulation in a simple way, and that's not where you're going to see it. So I think what you're getting at is very, very important. I think also on this kind of idea of we've located the optimal, like things are invisible when they're entirely efficient. We're, like you're saying, we are mindless. So what we're doing is, if our goal is to be completely optimal and rational, it's to make everything irrelevant or invisible or inconsequential or not stand out. It's like Blondel said, you know, it's kind of comical for him that philosophy is in the business of certainty, because just as soon as you're certain of something, you stop caring about it. You look for something else, right? So then philosophy's goal is to like kill itself, basically. And in fact, the ability to stop and say, well, I'm going to look at this bowl and see all the dimensions of it, that requires like asserting yourself against just using the bowl to eat the food, which then also runs the risk of the people looking at you funny. It's like, why is Dan looking at that bowl instead of eating out of it? That guy's weird, right? Like, and the last thing I'll say, and then if you have another comment, Mr. Ebert, I'll give it back to you before Mr. Parsons and then Phillip, is that like a lot of people like, why are you reading that book, right? Like if you're these, you know, liminal web people and you're not taking a class, you don't have a test, like, why are you reading that book? It's almost like you have to go, I'm doing it because I don't have a why, so that there is life in my whys when I have them. Like you have to do these things that there is no why to, so that the very quality of the things you do have whys for have life in them. And if you do know things that don't have like just the kind of raw doing it for its own sake, then it actually, the quality of the things that are rational or efficient or optimal aren't even that anymore. They lose a certain life. They become all, like you're saying, death, because it's too flat at that point. But let me get Mr. Ebert, please.
Yeah, free will can't be found in inertia. And even if the inertia was begat by an instance of a no or a free will, for instance, let's just say Marx, at the moment of being like, wait a minute, and then between the wait a minute and the development or publishing of Das Kapital or something, another inertia occurs, right? Where suddenly now, oh, now I'm writing this big no. But during the process of writing that big no, if one enters a state of inertia within the no, well, that's no longer free will. And it's not that free will is a good thing, because then otherwise all you'd be doing is saying no to everything, thinking that's the best thing to do. It's just that we're designed to be efficient creatures. We're designed to be automatic as much as possible. Otherwise, we're just going to be in a pure entropic state of energetic disequilibrium and wasting energy everywhere. The mind literally operates. It's totally unavoidable to behave outside of the paradigm of energetic efficiency. We would not have subconscious, we wouldn't have knowledge acquisition. It's like you said, as soon as you figure out that one thing is certain, you don't, it's not that you don't care about it anymore, you forget about it. And it's not that you literally forget about it, like I no longer know what that is, but you know it so well that you no longer think about it in active terms. And that's not some weird curiosity. It's literally energetic, like a requirement to exist. Otherwise your energy dissipates and you dissolve and you're dead. Your brain your brain would just sort of dissipate. So yeah, actually I'd be curious, just on a random whim, to study if there are any cerebral maladies that can be could be characterized by an inability to energetically, like, create energetic efficiency when it comes to memory storage, not knowledge acquisition, etc. The brain is just always constantly relearning, can't migrate anything into automatism. Anyhow, cool.
I think that's very well put. And just as a quick comment, and then I'll give it to Parsons and Phillip. One of the issues is everything you've been said is not, when people say, is the market rational? The problem is what you just described goes to what could be rational, makes everything flat, everything kind of low energy and different things. The problem is that often classically when they asked, is the market rational, they meant it more in the terms of, does the market create wealth, create innovations, create ways to solve problems, like it's rational in the creative problem set. And up till about the 18th century, sure. But then the issue is there's a systems rationality that's different from the rationality that is trying to creatively problem solve. And actually the systems rationality tends to eclipse and to dominate over the creative expression of problem solving. And so what you're getting at has massive implications. I strongly believe that basically the proper understanding of rationality is yet to make it into economic theory. And in fact, I'm very critical of the way that they use game theory, because they use it not as a revelation of the necessity of the suboptimal and the non-rational, but as what do we need to do to have a strategy to keep the systems always rational. I'm quite critical of the way that game theory is employed. So I loved what you had to say. Let me give it to Mr. Parsons and then Phillip. Mr. Parsons.
Yeah, your conversation, I was listening to you and Layman, and that's the point, is that capitalism has gotten us, so far down the road but Layman is saying, stop. What if we can bend capitalism to, benefiting our groups, or benefiting how we go about wanting to see change and see those things. And I think, you were hitting on that's the sublimation of capital, and where I think, most Marxists would be, I'm not, that'd be bad, but where it's kind of hit a dead end, but they are pointing to that something's gone awry. And that's, Mr. Ebert brought that point, that's, Zizek's point, is that's Marx is the first one to use the symptom. He's diagnosing society, but it's almost like we have to start seeing our symptoms as the things that, that's the non-rational part that's causing a block to us going forward. And the symptom is our holy man, in a way, leading us to where we could go. And I had another point, but I kind of spaced it. But no, it's just, how can we use those symptoms in a way, almost like, oh yeah, that was it. That, like, where these law, like, I was just thinking about Jewish tradition, and so many laws of Torah being built up, and at some point, whether that even be from the Talmud tradition, where you have these scholars going back and forth, is Torah going this far or that far, and they're kind of throwing a monkey wrench in the system. Either way it goes, whether that's conservative or liberal, but it gets conversation going to stir something up. But I think that's the point, is when game theory dynamics has only been used in a war scenario so much that it's like win lose, even in philosophical, like, most of the time before, like, groups like the Liminal Web, I used to listen to philosophical conversation. It was just win your point, you know what I'm saying, beat the other person down with your philosophical understanding of some idea. But at that point you're kind of losing, and then the other side could just go, well, you're playing these language games and you're making more of this or that. But I don't know, I'll leave it with that.
No, I think that was all excellent. First off, thank you very much for pulling on the side of the road and being part of the net. That's very kind of you, Mr. Parsons. It means a lot. Second, thank you for listening to the Layman Pascal conversation. And then third, I love the phrase "symptom as your holy man." That's magic. Really like it. Get your holy man, get your symptom. So that's great. We're pass it to Phil. The other thing, so basically, like, out of that conversation, the only way to do, like, what's very tricky with the question, like with the Meta Modern Business Bureau on the question of how do you make the liminal web economic sustainable, what would an alternative economic model look like, is everyone has so much trauma from economics and numbers and pricing that the moment you mention it, it becomes very difficult. But if the thing is not thought, then you do have a question of, to what degree can you make sustainable communities? How will you do money differently? You're like, oh my gosh, capitalism is evil and it's destroying everything. Well, if we don't have a way to think about economics and politics alternative to that, that could be a problem, right? So, we were getting into all that. And basically, for me, when you start talking about the necessity of multiple metrics or multi-perspectivalism, that means basically what has to occur is regaining politics in a proper sense, in terms of a commons, a polis, because you have to basically, so to put it very quickly, and then I'll give it to Philip, if there's something about the suboptimal, the non-rational that is required for systems to not become dead, basically, then we have to have a space to describe or discuss or debate how we're going to be suboptimal, how we're going to be non-rational. What should be the non-rationality of this community? What should be the manner by which we can collectively be suboptimal so that we don't have those flatness? You have to have a kind of debate, right? You have to have a kind of discussion to determine how you're going to go about doing that, because here's the trick. No system will decide that. Like, so if you separate politics from economics and you only have the business, you only have the model, well, by definition, it doesn't consider the possible suboptimals or the non-rationalities, right? And so it can't do that. So you have to bring the politics in. But the problem is economics eats politics. It hates politics. Why does it hate politics? Because it hates the suboptimal. Because it hates the non-rational. It hates that. So we as human subjects, if you will, have to know you need that and actively include it. Well, frick. How do you go about becoming the kind of subjects that can do that? How do you spread the number of people that can do that without being totalitarian? That's where we're talking about the retreats and everything. The funny thing is, this kind of salvation of the non-rational, because I'll make a difference between non-rational, irrational, and rational. where kind of the non-rational is the thing that keeps rationality from eating itself, that cannot be reduced to a rational calculus, where irrational is the opposite of what's rational within a rational calculus. And so like you have to have a space to discuss the non-rational, but that would require a kind of education and awareness of how to go about doing that. And if you don't do that, then you're going to get this kind of flatness, right? That's very, very problematic. I'm going to give it to Phillip, and there was something else. I think that I was going to say I love you. So Phillip, please.
Love you too. And I have a vision of you in like a Times Square subway station with a sign that says, "Are you interested in belonging again?" You just passing out those books, just passing them out. One of the things with the suboptimal, I think, can lead to I don't know. I've always been kind of irked by the term partner, but I want to see if I can resuscitate it, because something about it just screams efficiency. You know, we're like, I get it. There are economics things to keep in mind. But I wonder if there's like a series of images where, you know, because like a lot of the relationships I've been in, we just lounge a lot. So like times where it's just like, maybe we could take Marx's Feuerbach thesis and have a picture of a couple thinking about the situation, and then a picture of a couple at like some rally or something like that. Just be like who you want to be. The idea of like, I don't know if this guy's name's Nin Tachtan, but he's like the mindfulness dude. Almost sounds like a bit of a neo-mysticism note, like a little bit of, you know, because Eckhart goes into like all these things of the creature, you know, and all these things of what maybe Gurdjieff would call like mechanical man. And then he says, let us be guided by the soul, by our higher selves. And in a way, I'm like, you know, this guy kind of nailed it. If I don't know if it's the exact language we would use, but I think in a way he's just like, maybe just have a little bit of distance to see what you're doing, and that distance maybe comes from this Bartleby, I would prefer not to. And then as far as like the expenditure, I am interested in what like Nietzsche or Bataille would say about that, because they're like super, as is a lot of Christian philosophy, interested in the image of the sun, which is this ball of energy that gives all the time with like no real reserve. And then what it gives to us, he calls the accursed share. So we have the surplus. What do we do with the surplus? And in a way, that's like our life. So I wonder if there's a way of, to invoke Hegel's topsy-turvy world, to admit that we're all upside down, and then to see how, to get right side up.
Oh, I like that very much. I think basically we are all standing on our head because of how the brain naturally works in the way that Mr. Ebert described. Like the very way that we make the world livable is to put it in intelligible terms that we don't have to think about, that kind of go into the background. Like it's a kind of forgetting, but it's not quite forgetting, which means that you're treating things as they are not. You're treating them, for Hegel, as understanding and not reason. So the very way that we function gets in the way of us being human, in a way. The way that the human functions keeps us from our humanity, to say it in different ways. And so, like, and Walker Percy basically said, if you're in a world where everyone's standing on their head, the only way to show them how to stand up is to look like you're standing on your head, right? And so if there's something about the non-rational, that's what is it? When you talk about the non-rational, it sounds like you want to stand on your head, right? Well, yes, because it's standing on your head relative to something standing on its head. So you have to do something that sounds kind of topsy-turvy when everything's topsy-turvy to get it not topsy-turvy in different things. And so that is the situation. I think when you talk about like Christian fallenness, humans having this kind of fallen character, like you actually see that. It's not necessarily a vague spiritual notion. It's just like, yes, the way the brain works sets us up to understand the world according to one-sidedness, not a dialectic in Hegel, saving energy versus creative energy. You see fallenness in biology. I think sometimes Christians, if you're really incarnational, then you should actually see the functions of your notions in the very way the body works, in the way that nature works, right? You know, if God is incarnational, if God created things, then fallenness should be reflected in the operations of material reality. And I think you see that in terms of the brain, especially in regard to human conceptibility. Also, as a quick note to something Andrew said, Mr. Parsons, is I think in the past, before Zoom, I've been calling it the Zoom tradition. You know, you had the oral tradition, the written tradition. It's now like the Zoom tradition, which is very interesting because it's a return to the oral tradition, but it has a record. And it's almost like the first time in human history you could combine the oral tradition and the written tradition. So we went through an oral tradition, we went through a written tradition, and now you have a kind of Zoom tradition where you're able to use oral conversation but record it at the same time. There will probably be transformations on the human mind in the Zoom tradition in the same way that writing for William Ong, Marshall McLuhan changed things. I think Zoom as a kind of, Marx talks about the material condition. I like to talk about the medium condition as a medium that will change how the brain thinks and operates. And I do wonder if a Zoom tradition helps us to be more prone to be conscious, more aware, more dynamic, and less susceptible to fall back in a kind of lifelessness. What's very interesting with also the example you were giving, what's funny about that Christ image of kind of Jesus, like God is always kind of pouring out creativity. What's really funny is that's really inefficient. Like it's super inefficient to be giving off energy all the time. And what's crazy to me, kind of on what Ebert was saying, is that efficiency has you not giving off life because you want to hold your life. You want to preserve your energy. What's weird is the brain's efforts to preserve energy kill energy. Whereas suboptimal boredom, like all these people on the liminal web who are in their leisure being inefficient seem to have like a ton of energy. They're like giving off energy. There's some weird dynamic here where when the human actually is more leisure or bored or the kind of Joseph Piper kind of stuff, they're more likely to become this explosion of energy. Whereas when they're trying to be efficient all the time, they have less energy exploding off of them. There's something weird going on there. And it shows, it's almost like fossil fuels versus renewable energy or something. It's like leisure creates a certain way the human expresses energy, or can, it depends on what we mean by leisure, that has this character of this explosion of energy, because it's almost like on the liminal web, you're not forced to use your energy in a certain way. You can read what you want, you can do different things. And so the energy is more prone to get going in that leisure, and then it's going everywhere. Whereas when you're in a job, you have to spend half your time forcing your energy into the tube of that thing you don't want to do. So you lose all your energy motivating yourself. Maybe that's what's going on. I'm speculating here, and I'll give it to Mr. Ebert. It's like when you're forced to do something efficient that you don't want to do, you spend all your energy motivating yourself. Whereas when you're in leisure or you're doing stuff like this, you don't have to spend 99% of your energy motivating yourself. You just let it go. And so there's something interesting here where efficiency that gets identified with a a good use of energy is actually a remarkable loss of energy, waste of energy, whereas leisure is actually a much more abundant use of energy, but it does so in a non-contained way. But because it's not contained, you don't have to spend any energy containing it or trying to motivate yourself. My brain goes there, but let me give it to Mr. Ebert and then back to Philip. Ebert, please.
Yeah, just go on a quick rant before I go try and buy some Christmas presents. I like what I think it was what Philip was saying regarding partner. So regarding efficiency, the most efficient thing imaginable is the one that literally cuts you out of the process. So for instance, the most efficient possible production of a song is the one that collapses the distance between sort of ideation and actualization, right? So you imagine that distance completely collapsed. Now you have the guitar, you have to learn the guitar, it takes 10 years, then you write a song. Now you have a guitar on a fucking keyboard button, right? And you're just like string, 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 and suddenly you're writing a song. Now you don't even need that. You just write a prompt, yeah, and that's like 3 seconds of your time. Now you have self-prompting machines, and all it's doing is spitting out songs, and all you do is receive them and be like, yeah, that one. So now you've completely removed yourself actually from the entire process of songwriting, because the most efficient possible line from A to B is the one which brings B to A, right? Okay, now you think about partnership, right? And my relationship. Well, the most efficient relationship is the one that cuts you out of the relationship. And so when we use language when we use language like partnership or efficient language of efficiencies, and if it reminds you of that, and that's your phenomenological response to that, then you're going to feel more and more alienated from the very relationship to which you're referring. You know what I mean? Anyway, I just want to say that I likewise fucking hate the term partnership, and I am off to buy some Christmas presents, but it's been really nice to be here. I can't wait to, by the way, what I've been doing with these recordings, I take them to rev.com. I have the whole goddamn thing transcribed, and then I pick out my parts and I use them for my book. All right, y'all. So I have this place to thank, and I'm also obviously picking parts that are relevant that you guys say. So I don't know how any of that will end up being represented, but it's quite fun to do, and it's fun to see this stuff on paper.
Well, that's marvelous, Mr. Ebert. I wish you the best. Thank you for stopping in. Best of luck.
Right,
and thank you. And I very much look forward to your book. It's absolutely hilarious where, well, it's like we say on the difference between, for me, the difference between system and kind of like, where you have a lot of game B or smaller communities where they're like, we're going to get out of game A. And, you know, it's kind of like they're bound by the shared ideology. And when you have a small group, and I'm not saying ideology in a bad way, you could just say worldview. Well, when you have a small group of self-selected similar people, you can basically make it work just by talking and negotiating. But when you get bigger and bigger of a scale, you have to create a system. And the virtue of a system is that it works without the human element. Like, you don't have to have everyone be similar and get along in order to make the system work. The beauty of capitalism is it doesn't need people to like one another to work. It just works regardless. That's the virtue of a system. The vice of a system, though, is it doesn't need the human element to work. That's why that's the problem. The very virtue of a system is its vice. And yet, the larger the scale and the greater the difference, the more likelihood you're not going to be able to make the community or nation work by pure negotiation. You're going to need a system. Well, what do you do when your system's leading you to the accelerationist apocalypse? What are you going to do when your system makes too big to fail? What are you going to do? Well, then the trick now is basically we need a system that maintains a human element, a new form of political economy that has it. Well, the way I've been wording it and belonging again is we need not a, we want to move from system to strategy. Because strategy is system and strategy are not necessarily the same. But strategy also has a operation regardless of difference that can occur, but it also can be corrected through human negotiation. If we cannot do this, then we do have an issue. Now, I just said a lot right there, and a million more things need to be said. But it is very funny that the whole virtue of a system is that it works without the human, but that means it kind of works to remove the human. That's the move that has happened with Western civilization. Somewhere, at some point, the system that could work without the human started to work to remove the human without become to remove. And that switch, which I think you can give an account for what occurred, but there's things to say. That seems to be what we're caught in now, that we have to work against and think against.
It was oceanic navigation and international trade that kind of started the
Oh, Nick Land, is that Meltdown? Yeah.
But like, what I think one of the things, especially in this moment, not only looking at, all of the workings of capital, but also the critiques, and asking, like, are these actually critiquing, or are these ways of keeping it running in exactly the same direction?
That's right.
And instead to see maybe there are some, maybe you're familiar with the French sociologist Gabriel Tard. There's a book by a French philosopher named Bruno Latour called The Science of Passionate Interests. And this guy just goes in so hard on like such a different line, short book, quick read, that I think may have some emancipatory potential, because the container I feel ourselves to be in, as far as the rationale of capital, is this triumvirate of investing, consuming, producing. David Harvey comes in and says there's limits. There's limits to this. And if that is like a good use of energy, we will be seen as whatever the word is, delinquents or nincompoops for doing anything outside of those three. Because, I mean, in a way, we all know, well, a lot of us know that we have finite energy. We have finite time. Why would you use it on something that wasn't in that in that container? But the only thing to maybe keep humanity going, as far as we know, would be, getting out of that box.
That's exactly right. I'll give it to Mr. Parsons. Well, the funny thing about it is what that suggests is that you literally have to, well, this is where you ultimately cannot separate the practical from the speculative, because there's a point where the practical leads to self-effacement. And so you have to have the reason to speculate to correct the course of pragmatism or practicality from that self-effacement. But the very efficiency of pragmatism up to that point will make it seem irrational to listen to the speculative knowing. And so there's a mechanism that you have to break through that's a kind of turn of history, when why would you think history was turning, in a sense, if up to this point it is not? Like, that's the problem. Like, when you look back at history, you're like, we haven't needed speculative reason to get on. We've been fine with efficiency and practicality. Why would you think that right now we need to change the course with some sort of speculative reasoning? Where's your proof? Well, by structure of the pragmatism, you don't have the proof. But if proof is what's needed in order to legitimize a change of course, then by definition, the course cannot be changed, and the self-effacement is then inevitable by the terms of what is allowed into the discourse. And so this is where, like, you see the consequences. Like, the weird thing is you have to have speculative knowing per se to recognize the value of speculative knowing. Well, then why would you ever get speculative knowing if it doesn't have value to you before you get there? That's where, like, Christianity is talking about grace and the movement of the spirit and the mystery and the wind comes and where it goes. And throughout basically all of human history, what makes people the weirdos, who for some weird reason seem to understand the value of speculative knowing, has been rather mysterious and rather random, et cetera, so forth. Like I was saying with Layman, it seems we're in a historic moment. I'll give you back to you, Phillip, for a comment, and then Andrew, is that we exist in a moment now where we seem to have to figure out what does it and then be intentional about integrating it into a strategy. That's weird. Phillip, please.
We could read Pareto with Hegel, in the sense that this is always already there. And
yes.
Pareto talks about this great war between, he calls it an instinct for combinations. And I might even say an instinct for novel combinations, nothing new under the sun, whatever, and group persistences. And when these two fight, something happens. And, the spirit of our time may be seeing some kind of death of group persistences, but they hold on most right before they go away, because those new combinations are so foreign.
Yes, I think that's very well put. I think you are at some sort of saturation. As we talked about in the class, it's the end of true history, and the end of true history requires either the negation sublation into absolute history or the end of history. Because if history, because if true history, if the end of true history is the end of history, then it's not the end of true history, it's just the end of history. There was no alternative path. See that it conceals itself in that, right? So in order for this to be the end of true history, it would have to be negated sublate into the absolute history. And if it's not, it's just the end of history in general. This will get us into having, I think ultimately this is the moment in history. I'm going to say something, I'll say something big and hand it to Mr. Parsons. This is the moment in history where we mistakenly confused our evolutionary course as being the continuation of dolphins as opposed to mammals. So I've been studying the difference between the dolphins evolutionary tract versus the mammal evolutionary tract. In the last 300 years, we've made civilization for dolphins. As opposed to mammals. And that has led us to artificial intelligence as opposed to human communal intelligence. Artificial intelligence is the logical end of dolphin evolution. So anyway, Andrew Parsons.
Yeah, and I was just going to say that it seems like it's just, is it going to be, artificial intelligence, it keeps like closing us down. And we keep all of these things that were these suggestions, this end of history, in a Hegelian sense, is this opening up? Is it open up to new possibilities, new realms, new ways of seeing ourselves? And it just keeps coming to me like you were talking about, how we spend our time in these leisure events, these things we're doing here. These are the most meaningful things to us that builds up what it means to be me, or am I just doing the locked in time, the time I'm kind of giving away and draining, also doesn't feed me. And almost in a sense, like you're saying, these grace, these spiritual energies, we almost get that feed our soul, that get us going on to the next, connections to other human beings, that are we going to open up to these possibilities or close down to them? And I think it seems like all of our technologies are just closing it down.
I think that's exactly right. And I think, one of the tricks is that you kind of have to do these things that seem like being on the liminal web or reading books when it's not for class. You have to do all of these things that have no guarantee of being like used for anything in order to be prepared for the encounter. Like we said on the class, like for some reason, like all the people on the liminal web basically must have done that, especially if they have no university connection, which most of the people who are younger don't. They must have, for some reason, chosen to do something suboptimal. That's why they're prepared to be part of these discussions. But that means in order to even be in the place where you can ask the questions of how do we make a new kind of community, you had to go through years of preparatory work already doing the suboptimal without guarantees. So here's the trick. The only way to have these alternative ways of doing stuff is to do things that have no guarantee. If you want a guarantee, you're in AI, you're in systems. It is incredibly non-rational to do stuff without a guarantee. But that is the kind of glitch in the matrix, if you will. The possibility of the human doing things that they care about, Heideggerian care, without guarantee. That is the possible glitch in the matrix. The possibility of going on a pilgrimage for no reason, really. The possibility of being at a net conversation when you're not being paid for it. But you see, the reason why I like the language of non-rational is because I don't think we can call this irrational. In a way, relative to neoliberalism, it's irrational, but relative to us, it's more so non-rational. But these are the things that the human can do that don't have a guarantee. But here's the other thing, what's weird about it, when you're in these kind of conversations or you have these quality of relationships, the value is not abstract, the value is concrete. You definitely experience the value. I think it's very important to kind of like, for more of the liminal web kind of people to own the fact that their quality of experience with people, because of the books of the read and the work they've done on the spiritual side, that difference of interaction is very, very, very tangible, even if it's invisible, even if it's hard to put into words. Because if you can get that, then you can understand that doing non-rational things does not lead to untangible results in non-concrete results. I'm looking for a word here because we all know a party that's fun to be at versus a party that's not to be fun at. Is the difference concrete? Absolutely, the difference is concrete. You know darn well the difference between a fun party and a non-fun party, but it's not concrete in the same way as a cup, right? the thing is that what non-rationality can do for you is very, very clear. Maybe the word is clear. It's very clear what it does to you, even if it's not as material as having a new car or something, right? Well, if you can at least own that and know that in your mind, it becomes easier to lean into the non-rational. It becomes easier to own it because you see the difference in quality of experience. You also see, in my experience, I think you can see people who don't do it, they may be more susceptible to manipulation, political capture, having their life taken over by technology. Like that's the David Hume self-defense thing. You also see what happens when you don't have the self-defense of the non-rational skills. You know, your life gets lived for you. So the more you see that, the more you get it. But what's very interesting, and then I'll give it to Phillip here, like, the human will survive to the degree they are willing to do the things that have no guarantee. You could, you know, that sounds like faith, right? That sounds like putting your eyes on the unseen. That sounds like hope. So the question is, how do we have our faith not be a faith in a technology per se, or faith in a kind of AI, but a faith in the human? Here's the key. The only way to have human faith in the human is to have faith in the non-rational dimension of the human. If you put your faith in human rationality, well, you're going to end up with AI. You know, that's the issue, right? But then the problem is, if you put your faith in human, say, irrationality in the kind of stupid negative sense, well, then you're not making a difference. The system will just say, well, that's irrational and go on without you, right? You know, you're not being productive. You're not, in terms of capital, you're irrelevant, so on and so forth. So we have to figure out how to lean into the non-rational. But like I was saying with Layman in that conversation, then I'll give it to Phillip. It seems like the key is business models that have no guarantee, which you're all learned in business. You're supposed to have a business model that can guarantee profit. Well, there's no loopholes, right? But if we talk about a business model that's 99% going to work, but there's a 1% possibility that you're taken advantage of by the customer because you have to trust in their assessment of the product, well, that means there's space for the human element. So we might be in the age of 99% models, not guaranteed models. That'd be a 100% model. We might be in the age of thinking about economics and systems as, how do we have 99% efficiency at most, but always have that 1% that makes space for the human? Because the difference between the 99% and the 100%, following Layman Pascal's metaphysics of adjacency, is the difference between life and death. So there, you know, we were talking a little bit like that. I said a lot, but I'm going to pass it to Phillip. And I was going to talk more about dolphins because that's E.O. Wilson's spread of social, the social dominance of the earth book that he did on the difference between dolphins and mammals evolution, which we have overlooked, and thus we're dolphins now, basically. But anyway, Phillip, do you feel like a dolphin?
I do. Yeah. I mean, if you'll just grant me an image of a bed, almost as like a grave, and the difference between life and death, something like, how do you get out of bed? I think this is something where, like, okay, if it's 99%, like, and there's a little bit of risk, you're like doing a little jig. You're like, let's see what happens. Let's go. Like, it's kind of like this, what if versus like, what if?
Yeah.
It's like super scared, which pushes you towards the illusion of anything in life having a guarantee, versus like, I wonder if I, you know, kind of like walk the tightrope adeptly, maybe something, you know, will come that'll make me want to get out of bed tomorrow. And I'll just do that until I can't anymore.
I think that's magnificent. Basically, when people talk about nihilism, meaning crisis, or different things, the answer to that is adrenaline. It's hard to be a nihilist when you have adrenaline. It's hard to be a nihilist when you're wondering and saying, ooh, what could happen? The meaning crisis follows from 100%. It follows from guarantee, because you know what's going to happen. It's all guaranteed. You have your plan, right? You know what's like, the key is with, and I don't have a problem at all with the meaning crisis. Like, we've talked about it many times, but the idea is that often, like, human beings, let's put it this way. The high majority of people on planet Earth, like 90% of people, still believe in some sort of divine power, right? They actually still believe the universe is infused with meaning. Well, that would mean that the meaning crisis for most people cannot primarily be a result that the universe is cold and empty. It has to be something else is going on, probably in terms of socioeconomics, family, and so on and so forth. Now, don't get me wrong. There are millions of people who are probably more college educated, who the meaning crisis is a reflection of a cold, empty universe. So that work is very important. From your Wolfgang Smiths, I know that Henriquez and Vervaeke have done transcendental naturalism. There are millions of people of whom that benefits. So I am not discounting that. But you also overfit if you only interpret the meaning crisis as a result of the universe being cold and empty and God being dead, because that is not what describes 90% of people. And yet, many of those people who believe in God are nihilistic. That's what you can actually believe in God and be nihilistic. That, like, you see no point or bored or the universe, because basically the nihilistic theist is someone who says the universe has fallen and they're waiting for the second coming, or they're waiting to die, basically. That is a kind of form of nihilism, because you're seeing that life is nothing until I die, until God comes back, right? And so there is a form of theist nihilism. So the other key that means, though, is you could actually theoretically believe the universe is ultimately meaningful, but meaningless right now, right? That is a possible category that I actually think describes a ton of Protestants in particular. Not all, I'm not bashing on Protestants, but that tends to be some of the apocalypticism that you have in some of their thinking. So the question becomes the following. Okay, what then is the primary cause of the meaning crisis, in the sense of so many people don't have significance? It's because their life is entirely predictable. It's because their life is entirely mapped out. There's no surprise. They're not working on anything outside of their career. They're just going through the motions. Well, here's the issue. A lot of people going to the motions go to the gym. They have community practices. They go to church. You can do all the things that can signify meaning and it be the motions, unless you have the 1% of uncertainty. That's where the unknown and mystery is so critical in your model. But the mystery cannot merely be transcendental mystery. It literally has to be Friday. What could happen Friday? If the mystery is the kind of beatific vision that there's a mystery after you die, that then you can kind of be lost in forever. I'm not saying that's a bad conception of God. That's a much better conception of God than some conceptions of God. But you must bring the mystery into Friday. You must bring the mystery into today. That's why the phenomenological experience, Flannery O'Connor, all those things is a big deal. But you are literally taught that you are practical, rational, and responsible. The tyranny of responsibility is especially a problem here. You are responsible to the degree that there is no mystery. You are a responsible person to the degree that everything is predictable. That means you are responsible to the degree that you fall into the meaning crisis. So that's what's happened. People are literally responsible to the degree that they fall into the meaning crisis and thus develop mental health, all the different things. Literally, the values are directed in a manner that makes people responsible to fall into those problems, because we don't understand the necessity of the non-rational in the human experience in order to have 99% instead of 100%, because we don't understand the nature of thought in general. We don't understand how the brain works. We don't understand the conditions under which the human being thrives, because we are socially and evolutionarily selecting to make us like dolphins. And what I mean by that is that in the evolutionary history, E.O. Wilson asks a really funny question. He says, why didn't dolphins take over the earth? You know, why is it that suddenly the certain branch of mammals, their brains started to getting big really fast and they just kind of took off? And he says, if you look at the dolphin, shouldn't have happened. So he gives like 3 reasons. First, he says that humans got thumbs. We could pick up objects. And because we could pick up tools, we could say, what is this and what might I use it for? So the thumb allowed for the consideration of technology. And I'm not trying to say I'm some sort of expert on evolutionary theory. I'm just giving Mr. E.O. Wilson's account as I recall. Dolphins have flippers. So it's very difficult for them to have many tools. They can hit things with their nose, but they can't hold things very well. They can eat them, but not hold them. Okay, so thumbs was important. But you know what the really big one was? The campsite. The campsite was a big deal, because you can gather with other animals and look at them and gather. And those are the conditions in which what is possible? Intellectual exchange. So eventually under those conditions, abstract language begins to develop. And so what ends up happening is the campsite, the key point is it's not so much what we see is it's not that the brain grew and then we went to the campsite, is that the going to the campsite started to correspond with the growth of the brain. Like the environment and the biology developed together. This is critical. It's now obviously there are genetic advantages, but the key things that we've got to understand with genetics and biology is biology develops in response to the environment. It's not just that we created, so you can't say that the reason we created campsites is because we had large brains. Yes, we had larger brains than other animals because of thumbs and whatever, but the brains got bigger once they got to the campsite, you see. So the campsite is a necessary development in the intellectualism. So this is my point. The dolphin is an isolated autonomous rationality. It is a non-social communal intelligence. What is the logical end of an autonomous non-social intelligence, or an intelligence that when it interacts with other dolphins, it's random? That's the key. When dolphins kind of have community, it's very sparse, it's all over the place, but they don't have a campsite. They don't have a regular gathering of intellectual exchange. What is the end of that? Artificial intelligence. That is where, that's the artificial intelligence is the supreme development of dolphin intelligence. The supreme example of human intelligence requires something like the liminal web, something like philosophy. This is the key. Like, because we as human beings have optimized for efficiency and defined efficiency as basically intelligence that doesn't need the human, we've actually socially arranged ourselves to be like dolphins. And so what we have done is actually moved human intelligence toward dolphin intelligence in the computer in a very funny way. To regain that, we have to do these communal things. We have to regain the campsite.
Thanks.
See you guys again. Yeah, I hope you have a great day, guys.
I really enjoyed it. It was good to see you there. Jacob Kashir, how you doing,
Thanks,
sir?
guys. Thank you.
Happy trails.
Good to see you. I don't know if you can hear me, but thank you.